Hello, I am that Rob Human, and this is part 4 of my Tabletop Playground mod development series. In this episode, we're going to be diving into cards and tokens a little bit. I don't expect this to be entirely exhaustive, but more an outline of some of the gotchas and caveats that I've encountered when I've made cards. We'll walk through the basics and some of the concepts, but I encourage you all to experiment with the editor after you watch this to get a feel for all the different settings that I might not have touched on. Before we dive into this, though, I'm going to let you know that I've moved the token textures into their own folder and updated the templates, so that is a small change that I've made. There's no practical repercussions to this, other than if you move them on your own and don't update the templates, it'll yell at you about missing textures, so just something to be aware of. Obviously, I've added all the card textures for this episode into this subfolder, and we'll dive into what some of these mean when we go to create our first set of cards. So I'm going to come into the editor here, and we're going to edit the selected package, and there's our cuboid from before and our starship from our last episode, and I've created this folder for cards already. So I'm going to create a new object, and before I actually create the card or the tile and token is one thing I want to point out here is that cards and tokens are functionally identical. Even more so, it's not even that they're identical in all the ways that matter. No, they're actually identical from the game's perspective. They are indistinguishable in terms of scripting or in terms of any kind of functionality or whatnot, to the point where if you actually create a tile/token, you'll see that the card, the type of object is card. The only difference here in when you go to create the objects is what are some initial settings that are defaulted to on or off. So that's something I want to point out and people get tripped up on a little bit, is these are actually exactly identical. So I'm going to create a card, and this is actually more analogous to creating a deck of cards. It's just going to start with one card, but we'll get to that in a minute. So I'm going to just pick out my card grid to start with, and we're going to hit create. And right off the bat, this looks a little funky, and we'll get to why in just a second. But before we do, pretty much all the stuff that applies to generic objects in here applies to cards. I mean, obviously there is no models because it's all auto-generated. But, like, you know, your ground access and your object type, all the same. One caveat with that, though, is that you can't actually modify the materials. You can't set your primary color. In fact, I think the secondary color should be disabled. I'm not sure why it's accessible, but it is. It shouldn't be. It has no effect. And likewise, roughness and metallicity are disabled. And that's because cards don't use roughness and metallicity, and cards only use the primary color under certain circumstances, which I'll get to. Just something to be aware of. In fact, this is why in the generic object tutorial I mentioned that I prefer to make tokens out of generic models instead of tokens. This is why. Because the surfaces cannot have different colors to them procedurally. Like, you can't actually change the colors according to a texture or anything like that. So I prefer to make my tokens out of generic objects and make my cards out of card objects. Just something to be aware of. Again, we'll dive into when you can actually use primary color in just a minute. The other thing here is that tags and metadata and scripts apply to the deck, not the specific card. We'll get into how that how we set metadata and tags for specific cards. You can't actually set a script on a specific card within a deck, and that has a bit of repercussions here and there, but we'll probably dive more into that when we get into the scripting tutorial. But suffice to say, these things affect the deck. These things affect the deck. All of this affects the card. So with that, we'll dive into this. Over here, we've got our the image that we picked for the front, and it actually replicates it on the back. Up top, we've got a couple toggles that let you simulate the state. So like if I flip this over, you probably can't tell the difference right now, but this basically simulates what would happen if the card is flipped. We'll get that in a second. And this just illustrates what the card is like when it's hidden. You can probably see that better if I flip it over. It's got this purling noise that slowly undulates. And we'll dive into what those all mean in just a minute. So this card that I have here, and I'm going to show this texture here, actually has 4 slots. I'm only using 2 of them, but it has 4 slots. The savvy among you might wonder why I've set them up so that there's all this wasted space. We'll get to that in a little bit. I'm not glossing over it. I haven't designed this poorly, but just want to say that out loud first. So I'm going to hide that. So, like I said, this is a setup, an atlas. This is actually what's called a texture atlas, where you've got multiple textures in one texture file. So this atlas has 2 by 2, so 4. To change how that behaves, or rather to change how the deck responds to using a texture atlas, we're going to switch these horizontal and vertical parameters. So I've got 2 by 2, so I'm going to change this to 2 by 2. You'll see now this first card, the only card in the deck, uses the first index from here. It just uses this. In fact, you can see the grid now. So that's like if you've got an array of cards that's like 16 by 16, you would put in 16 by 16. Probably going to be a huge texture, but like that's okay. The other thing you can do here is you can set the back image type. In this case, right now, it uses the same texture. So, for example, I've kind of got 2 slots that are unused. I could put the back in this 4th slot and then change this back index to 4, and you'll see that the back, this is currently the back. If I flip this over, it'll be the front. The back uses that 4th slot. This is good if you have, you know, n-2 cards, where n is the number of slots in the texture. And I say n-2 and not n-1 for a very specific reason. And that specific reason actually leads us very nicely into the next bit, which is the hidden. We're going to skip over most of this for right now. Don't worry, we'll pivot back to that. This hidden type is what happens when a card is in your hand or in your card holder. And in your hand, I mean like is currently picked up by a player. There's an option to disable this, so like hide in hand, if you turn that off, it'll just show as though it were the card, but it won't be hidden, like if you don't want to show your poker hand. The hidden type is what determines the behavior of the card while it's being held, or if it's in your card holder. So I'm going to change this from blur, and we can go to a front image and say index 3. Now again, I'm not actually using index 3, but if I had n-2, where n is the number of slots, say it's 16, and I only had 14 cards, or up to 14 cards, I could use 15 for the hidden image and 16 for the back. The other options here are the card back. So basically make the hidden state identical to as if it were flipped over. I actually don't recommend doing this. And the reason why is because it sends mixed signals to other players. A great example actually came up in a game of TI4 that I was spectating on, where the back is, or the hidden state was the same as the back state. And this caused a bit of a problem because as one player who picked up the card saw the front of the card and was trying to explain, oh yeah, this is the card that I have in my hand right now. Can't you see it? And they saw the back, because that's what the hidden state was. And they were like, no, it looks like the back. Flip it over. And they flipped it over, and then they saw the back again. And it wasn't until like, oh, flip it again and then put it down. It sends mixed signals. I don't recommend doing that. What I do recommend is actually using either the front image with a dedicated slot for it, or a separate file entirely. And I've actually got one here. I've got _H for hidden. And that actually, puts that there. I know it's warped. Don't worry, we'll get back to that. So this hidden state is distinct from the back and distinct from any of the fronts. And it's a clear indicator of this is currently hidden. I strongly recommend having a separate hidden image for your decks. So we're going to pop back up here to the shape. Right now it's set to rounded corners, and that is the shape of the mesh that it generates. You could do sharp corners if you want that sharp look. You could do round, and right now it's kind of oval, but if we change this to be a square size, it'll actually be round. And same goes for the hexagonal. I can't remember what the name of the game is in Star Wars that they play in solo, but I think they use hexagonal cards. It's not Pazak, it's the other one. Sabak? What have you. Also, Battlestar Galactica. They use hexagonal cards for their poker-esque analog. I can't remember which one is which, because they actually changed the name, by the way. Bit of trivia. In the old Battlestar Galactica, the rugby analog was named one thing. It was either triad or pyramid. And the poker analog was named either triad or pyramid. And when they rebooted the series in the 2000 Musuma, they switched the names so that the rugby analog was called the other thing and the poker analog was called the other thing. So they swapped the names between the two series, which is why I can never remember what they're called. The more you know. Anyways, so you can have those predetermined and pre-generated textures for your shapes. However, you can also do, and I'm going to swap this back to 6 here, you can actually change it so that you have a custom image. The way the custom image works, and I'm actually just going to pop this in here, it will take the transparency of that image. Here it is. And that which is opaque will be part of the card, and that which is transparent will not be. This is the same way that the generic mesh image shape works. It's that same principle. So you can make your card a custom shape if you want. In fact, I like this curved bit. That's kind of a style of card that I've come to like visually. Now, just again, to put a little bit of a caveat on here, just because it looks weird in the screen, is it is squished horizontally. And that's because I've laid out my textures to be 512 by 512. Again, there's a reason for that, and I'll get to that in a minute. So if it looks wonky, I just widen it up so that it's actually square, and so the texture is no longer distorted, but it's actually card-shaped. So that's a thing. There's a couple caveats when it comes to image shape. For example, this option here, can flip and stack. What that means under normal circumstances is you can have face-up and face-down cards in a deck at the same time. So if that's relevant to your game dynamics, whether a card is face-up or face-down in the same deck, you can do that if you use one of the built-in shapes. If you're using the image shape, that's no longer allowed. So it'll actually disable it. You can't save it while that's in. I kind of wish this was disabled if image is enabled, but it's not. So that's just one caveat when it comes to the image shapes. You can't actually stack up and down cards in the same deck whilst you're using an image shape silhouette. Moving along, when you have a shape image, you can actually say, just like I mentioned in the generic assets, the convex hull colliders, by default it will generate a convex hull for your card silhouette. So like even if this were, say, shaped like a jigsaw, it will kind of have the collider will not respect concave areas, and that's because of performance reasons. So if you have a jigsaw puzzle piece and you need that space to be respected, you can turn on concave collisions. I would actually not recommend doing this either. Do it if you know what you're doing, but like the tooltip says, there is a performance hit with that, and it is not trivial. You're better off, I think, if you have a jigsaw layout, to use a generic object and be strategic in how you build your collider meshes. It'll be more efficient that way. Yeah, if you're doing jigsaw pieces and you're using cards for them, you're probably not doing it the right way, or at least not the most efficient way. Emissive front is basically, will it respect lighting? This is a good way to actually prevent shadows from showing up in your cards during play. I keep this on because I don't want cards to be affected by lighting. Personal preference, though. We kind of went into the grid layout and the size. You can thicken up your card if you want it to be chunky. 0.05 is fine. This option, use primary color, is what I was alluding to before with the materials. This is how you set the primary color of the card. If I enable it, you'll see that this becomes active. And I can then change the border image of, or the border color, the edge color of the card. But there's a little bit of a caveat with that too. If you have it set up such that your cards might end up in different decks, individual cards will not remember the color that they're in when you pull them out of a deck. So, for example, if I have two decks, A and B, and A is colored red and B is colored blue, and I took a card from deck A and put it into deck B, that card will become blue instead of red, which is where it was. And then I pull that card out, and it is now blue. So card colors are not persistent. So, for whatever that might matter for your utility, you can either turn off stacking, or what I tend to do is actually put the hex color of all of my cards to a thing and just keep it the same universally throughout my mod. So I'll just set it to 333333, and you won't notice that it doesn't persist because they're all that color. Going back to the image shape here, it is actually significant in another way, in that cards with different silhouette images cannot stack together. So if I have card, and in fact I think it's actually true for any shape. So like if I have deck A that uses rounded corners and deck B that uses sharp corners, they can't stack. Which makes sense, they're not the same shape. Why would they be stackable? So using a shape image is actually a pretty good way of making your cards distinct and unstackable. I think also you can use some tag stuff to kind of filter out what cards or decks are mergeable and which aren't. So that might be of use too. I haven't actually played with that much. Moving on, hide in hand. I think I went over this. I might have been another take. Hide in hand is, will it hide will go into the hidden state if I pick it up or if I put it in a card holder that is set to hide. So if you're okay with all information in your hand or being picked up being public, turn that off. If you are making a poker analog and you want hidden cards, you want that turned on. Use with card holders is basically, can they be drawn into your card holder or not? Turn that on and off as need be. I believe, and this is going back to what I said at the beginning about cards and tokens being identical, I think if you were, and don't quote me on this, if you were to create a tile/token object instead of a card object, I think these two are just unchecked. That's the only difference, and you can change those just as readily. It's just kind of the initial state of the setup. So that's the thing. Can flip and stack I talked about. Allow online images. So this is a little bit of a weird one. When you're in-game, not in the editor, but in-game, if this is enabled, you could actually have players replace the image with a web link, an HTTP link. So this could be good if you have, an API somewhere that stores all your card images. However, there are two problems with this. Two problems with this. For one, it is changeable in-game. In fact, it's not even changeable in the editor. It has to happen in-game or while you're building the initial state of the game. The other issue is that it's fragile. If the image goes away on the internet, you're not going to be able to play your game. I know Tabletop Simulator uses remote linking for almost everything, and frankly, that's kind of a problem. I've had a lot of issues where assets are just no longer available. So I would use the allow online images only if absolutely necessary. It is honestly better and wiser to just include all the textures that you need in your mod. It's a lot more robust. Moving on, we're going to come down to the section here, which is the actual cards in this deck. Now, right now, there's only one card, which is this, I'm going to unhide here, this Ace of Diamonds. And again, we've got this as our texture, so if I were to actually just create another card, the next card will be the Ace of Clubs. And if I were to create, another one, it would be the third slot, which is currently empty, and so on. You can actually also hit this double plus, and if you do that and hit yes, it will actually create all 4 cards, because 2 times 2 is 4. It'll create all the slots available on your texture, as according to the grid layout. I don't actually want those last 2, so I'll delete them. Moving down, this is where you can actually lay out, card information. So, like, for some reason, suppose these are out of order, I can actually change that to 2, and this uses 1. Like, you can change which index in the grid your card is pointing to for its texture. It occurs to me we didn't really play with the back image type. We'll get to that in a second. The name of the card, and I could do Ace of Clubs. The cards, the name here is a little bit of a deviation from the template name that I mentioned in the last video. The template name does not show up in game. It only shows up in the object import screen, so you know what deck you're bringing in. However, the name of the card does show up. It shows up when it is a single card, and it also shows up, and when it is flipped upwards. So if it's face down, the name goes away, and if you have a deck of cards that's more than one card, that name goes away. But if you have the one card in isolation and face up on the table, this is the name that shows up in-game. So a little bit of a deviation from the template name. Just something to be aware of. Further down we have tags and metadata, and this is on a per card basis. So again, we'll probably get into this when we get into the scripting tutorials, but you can access metadata on a per card basis as well as on a per deck basis. Something to be aware of. Now, backtracking a little bit, this back image type, you'll notice that when I have this flipped, I've got, what is this, same file, index of 4. So this is that whole thing where I could add the back image onto this slot, and it will be the back image for all the cards in the deck. An alternative here is you could actually have a separate file. You can just point it to a different file completely, and it will reference that. Now, this is my preferred way to do it. I prefer having one reverse image for the deck, and it just uses that thing. That way I can use the same back image across multiple decks, and it won't care. So this is the back image that I've selected here. The other thing you can do here, cancel, if I go to same as front, so you can have like literally every card is its own front and back, so you get like the double-sided effect. And also you can do a separate file, but also indexed. So the way that this works is, and I'm actually going to use a different grid here, test grid. And just to show you what test grid actually looks like in context, this is the test grid. So this is the first slot, second slot, third slot, and fourth slot. The way that this works is every card will receive its own back from this different file. So what you can do with this is, if you have a set of cards where the back and front are distinct and individual, you have two sets of textures. You have a front texture and a back texture, and they all overlap. So you set the front to be one thing and the back to be another thing, and they'll all be individualized. Obviously, this is the way to go if you have two-sided distinct information. You can also use this if you want to have mixed backings in a single atlas. I wouldn't recommend doing that, but it is an option. So like if I had, say I wanted to have slots 1 and 3 to use one back, and then 2 and 4 to use a different back, I could set up the same 4 grid and have the same texture here and there, and then have a different texture here and there, such that, they'll all line up and you'll get 2 different backings in the same grid. Don't recommend doing that. At that point, I would just create 2 different decks. It's up to you, but that is how I would do that. For the sake of what I'm doing here, I'm just going to use... Oh, that's the wrong image. R for reverse. And this is separate file. There we go. That's kind of what I expect. So that's the front, that's the back, and that's what it looks like when it's hidden, and that's what it looks like when it's hidden and unflipped. So that's pretty much cards for you. The only other thing that I'll mention is the mirror back. I think... Yeah, I need to actually get this here. You probably can't tell because the image is mostly asymmetrical, but if you find that your backing is the wrong direction, just uncheck that or check that, depending on what you want to do. So I'm going to name this template here, and I'm going to save. And I guess now is as good a time as any to explain why I've done this in a 512 by 512 way instead of, tightly coupling it. And there's a couple reasons why. For one, I'm going to head back here and I'm just going to blitz through creating a new card. And I'm going to use this test grid. You'll see it's really colorful. I'm going to set that to this. I'm going to do sharp corners, and there's a 2 by 2 grid. 2 by 2. So this is the atlas that we're using, and you'll notice that this is pixel perfect. Actually, like this grid is laid out so that it is 512 by 512 for this card and 512 by that 512 for this slot, and so on. It might look like it's ringing a little bit, but I assure you, this is pixel perfect. And what I'm about to demonstrate is kind of an artifact of any kind of real-time model or any kind of 3D model when it has textures. You might be able to notice it here. You've got a yellow band running down each side, and this is actually a green band, even though it looks yellow right now. And if I were to actually go to the second grid here, not sure why that didn't update. Interesting. Oh, right, because I'm not looking at the flip side. Okay. You can see that there's a little bit of a blue band at the bottom here, or if I were to change this index, there is actually a little bit of a red band up top, though it's not as noticeable, and a what looks like a white one, and that's just because of how additive color works. And if you go to the blue one, you'll see this slightly cyan and white border. And that's just an artifact of how textures bleed into one another on atlases. This is just typical for texture atlases. So the way that I personally go about getting around this is I'll build cards that have bleed built into them. And that's why, if you notice, all the textures, in fact, if you go to the silhouette, I guess, have this border built in around it. You will never have bleed over from card to card. If your cards happen to have a black border, like Magic the Gathering cards, you won't notice this. So it's not a big deal. But it is something to be aware of if your art is like full card sized. My own way of getting around this is to just have a silhouette that is the shape that I want, that has a bit of a padding built in, so like there's a space around it. That's how I get around that. The other reason why I get into why I have this 512 by 512, even though I've got this wasted space on the sides, is because of the way that 3D models or 3D textures tend to get upscaled. A good example here is if I were to actually open up this TIE Fighter one, this card is not a power of 2 texture. By that I mean like its width is not 256 or 512 or 1024. It is a non-square or non-power of 2 texture. Power of 2 textures are a kind of an efficiency thing when it comes to video memory, and when it comes to scaling textures, 3D programs or really any image program prefers to have powers of 2. And that becomes a bit of an issue in legibility in certain circumstances. So one of the things that I like to do is just have powers of 2 for my textures as much as I can. So that's why you'll see that, yeah, the card itself takes up less room, but the texture itself is 512 by 512. The other side of that is that you can get away with actually doing something like this, where the height is 512, but the width is less than that. It is not actually a power of 2 width. The actual way that this works is this version of the card takes up as much video memory as this version of the card, more or less, because it kind of pads it out until it hits the next power of 2. This is why it's really bad to have a texture size that is like 600 by 600, because it'll upscale to 1024 by 1024 and take up a huge slot of memory. Huge, quote unquote. So it's usually beneficial to keep your textures at or slightly below a power of 2. You're best off doing at power of 2. Now, the reason why I can get away with this, where the higher dimension is a power of 2 and the smaller one is not, is because of how 3D rendering stuff happens when it comes to upscaling it. It will kind of pad out the outside until it takes up the next power of 2, and it'll keep the height the same. So the upscaling algorithm is slightly different. You can get away with this if you want. I like the simplicity of just using a power of 2, and that way I have explicit control over it, but it's up to you. This version of this card here is not a power of 2 in either direction. I can't actually tell you what the file size is off the top of my head, but it is less than 512 in both dimensions, whereas this one is actually 512 in both directions, and we'll get to the distinction on why that's important right now. So I'm actually going to back out of here. I'm not going to save it. I will blitz through creating another card, and we'll use the tie 1. Cool. And we'll do a sharp corners. That's good. So tie less than pow 2. Okay? Just a simple single card deck, nothing fancy. Okay, I'm going to come back out. I'll create another one that uses the other texture. Cards tie 2, create. You'll see that there's a weird border here. We'll get to that in a second. This is tie pow 2. Okay, so because I've used a square texture, I'm going to set the width to be square, and that actually de-distorts the image. And then I'm going to take the shape, I'm going to set it to the image, and I'm going to use this special silhouette that I have here. And that'll just tie it all together. Tie. Tie. Anyways, this is the silhouette. It basically just kind of chunks off the edge, and that's fine. It's kind of just for the sake of illustration here. So I'm going to save this as tie pow 2, and I'm going to go into game, and we will just set up a default state here, and I'm going to import both of those. This is less than power of 2, and this is the power of 2. And this might be really subtle, and it might not show up. Oh, I've made a mistake here. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, okay. So I'm actually going to just plop these on top of each other, and I'm going to hold down Alt and zoom over the image. Now, you're probably noticing that it's slightly scaled wrong, and that's because I didn't actually do the math here. 5.75. We'll save that, and we'll come back into here, and this is actually 8 by 8. I did the math on this earlier and just forgot to apply it. So these should now look identical, more or less. But, and I hope this shows up on screen, you'll notice that, again, this is this version right here. This one is less than power of 2, whereas this one is power of 2. So I'm going to hover over the less than, and then I'm going to slide my cursor over to the version that is. And it might not come across on video so well, but if you look at the text in the lower segment here, you'll notice that the anti-aliasing changes a little bit. And this might not be a big deal in this version, like on this card. In fact, the less than power of 2 might actually look better depending on your eye. But this can hamper card legibility. So if you're hitting issues where your card is not legible, whereas it looks legible on your texture when you're looking at it, like, yeah, that seems perfectly legible, but, it looks weird when I'm looking at it in-game. It looks a little fuzzy. And this is really subtle, but it can get exaggerated. It's probably because you've got a texture or a part of a texture that is less than a power of 2. And that can actually have some pretty significant implications as far as card legibility goes when it comes to little tiny bits of text. So that is a caveat that I've noticed, and this is how I've chosen to address it, which is just keep your textures as a power of 2. It makes things a lot easier, and it makes things a lot more explicit. A little bit more true to what the actual texture looks like. It also doesn't help that I'm using relatively low texture sizes, so you might get some artifacting in there too. I think it's perfectly legible here, but, you know, if you have the room to have larger card textures, go for it. But if you want to keep your texture sizes small and you want to maintain legibility, powers of 2. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Hopefully this wasn't too bad of an info dump. Just making sure I haven't gone through anything and missed anything, and no, it looks pretty good. Yeah, if you have any questions or if you want any clarifications, or if I'm unclear on any of this, by all means, leave a comment or hit me up on the Tabletop Playground Discord and I will clarify things. Best of luck.